True Murder.
It's a rare insight into a killer's tortured mind.
The most shocking killers in true crime history.
Victims were brutalized, shot, stabbed.
And the authors that have written about them.
Easy, Bundy, Dahmer.
I would also play with Yash, like if you play with sand.
The Night Stalker, BTK. Every week, another fascinating author talking about the most shocking and infamous killers in true crime history. True Murder, with your host, journalist and author,
Dan Zupansky.
Good evening. An examination of the unsolved mystery of the Jack the Ripper-style serial killer who terrified early 20th century Atlanta, Georgia. As Atlanta finished rebuilding after the Civil War, a new horror arose from the ashes to roam the night streets. Beginning in 1911, a killer whose methods mimicked the famed Jack the Ripper murdered at least 20 black women, from prostitutes to working-class women and mothers. Each murder attributed to the killer occurred on a Saturday night, and for one terrifying spring in 1911, a fresh body turned up every Sunday morning. Amid a stifling investigation, slayings continued until 1915. As many as 6 men were arrested for the crimes, but investigators never discovered the identity of the killer or killers, despite having several suspects in custody. Join local historian Jeffery Wells as he reveals the case of the Atlanta Ripper, unsolved to this day. The book that we're featuring this evening is The Atlanta Ripper, the unsolved case of the Gate City's most infamous murders, with my special guest, historian and author, Jeffery Wells. Welcome to the program, and thank you very much for this interview, Jeffery Wells.
Glad to be here.
Thank you so much. Tell us a little bit briefly about your background and how you came to be the author of this book.
Well, I appreciate you asking. Born and raised in Georgia and educated in Georgia. And after I finished my master's degree, I got a teaching job in the Atlanta area where I was teaching mostly American history courses. And in one of the courses, we were talking about 20th century American history, and we were focusing a good bit on race relations in the Progressive era. And I brought in Rebecca Ann Burns' book, Rage in the Gate City, which, as you know, is about the 1906 race riot. And I was making, some of the race relations, the problems we had in the nation in the early 1900s more local, looking at it through that lens. And so I talked about crime, a little bit about crime, and I'd shared with my students how much I enjoyed looking at the history of law enforcement and crime in the country. And after class one day, a young man said, "Hey, I was perusing the internet and I found this, and I thought that you might enjoy it." It happened to be Steve Fennessy's article in Creative Loafing magazine there in Atlanta about the Atlanta Ripper murders. And we read it together, very interested. I shared it with my class and showed them that, even though it didn't spawn from the 1906 race riot, that it was somewhat, there were nuggets of wisdom in there and information about the race relations that existed in the city at that time. So I taught school for high school and then college for some years, then got into doing this kind of research. And then eventually the History Press asked me to publish it after they saw an article I posted on my own blog site entitled The Atlanta Ripper. So that's kind of how the story was born.
Now, let's talk about the race riots in 1906 in Atlanta. And as you write in the book, tell us about the societal and cultural environment at that time, especially for blacks, but what also you write sets Atlanta apart at that time from other cities in Georgia.
Sure. Well, and Atlanta's kind of a railroad town. It was founded in the 1830s. I believe it was 1837 to be exact, where places like Macon and Savannah being the first city and the port city, a big port city on the Savannah River, and then later Macon being founded around 1823, it was a cotton destination. They would ship their cotton, these rivers, as cotton became king. Well, as Atlanta, which started out as Terminus and Marthasville, as Atlanta was founded, it blossomed into what we know as a railroad town. And there were lots of slaves in Savannah and Macon and in various parts of Georgia. Atlanta began to be a destination eventually for slaveholders, and there were slaves in and around the city of Atlanta. But the commerce there mainly focused on the railroad because Atlanta, the Chattahoochee River runs through there, but it didn't service the city nearly the way that the Mulgee River in Macon did and the Savannah River did in Savannah. So you've got some differences in the nature of the cities in Georgia. And then, of course, Atlanta becomes a very big city in the 20th and 21st centuries. But by around the 1880s, Atlanta began to grow. It began to be the hub of more of an economy that we would know as a regional economy. About 1900, you have about 90,000 people in the city. And then, well, actually, you have about 150,000 people. It eventually went from about 90,000 before that, blossoming into a bigger metropolis of about 150,000 between 1900 and 1910. Of that population, about a third were African American. Inside the African American community in Atlanta at that time, you have a burgeoning black elite leadership class. And there was some tension between them and the black working class, which, as you know, Dan, was also the black working class was the field, if you will, that the Atlanta Ripper, the Ripper murders happened in. The black working class, of course, the women who were murdered were in that class. Well, there's tension between them and the black elite who sought to separate themselves a bit from the black working class. And then, of course, the pressures on the black community in Atlanta from the white community who sought to separate themselves and segregate the classes, keep them separate and oppressed in the black community. Those are all the struggles that black Atlantans had to deal with at that time, most specifically the black working class.
Right. Now, you mentioned how important the race riot was to just setting up the environment that was the Atlanta Ripper.
That's right.
Environment he found himself in, and his victims as well. So let's talk about just briefly about this race riot and the effect of the race riot on the community itself. Again, sure. Readying the community for the reign of terror of the Atlanta Ripper.
Yeah, and that does provide a backdrop and some context. That actually emanates from the gubernatorial race in Georgia in 1906. You have, actually, it's kind of a battle of the two major newspapers that are now one newspaper in Georgia, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. At that time, they were two separate papers, the Atlanta Journal, the Atlanta Constitution. The former publisher of the Atlanta Journal was Hoke Smith. And he ran for governor in 1906 against Clark Howell, who was the editor of the Atlanta Constitution. Well, in that gubernatorial election, race relations and the burgeoning black community, the growth of the black community in Atlanta, and also the emergence of the black upper class was very much front and center in that campaign. As a matter of fact, I would say that Clark Howell and Hoke Smith were trying to out-racist one another, if you will, especially in 21st century terms. And terms like in their place, stay on that side, and those were terms that were actually used in that race. Now, Tom Watson, who was a populist and ran for vice president as a populist in the late 1800s, endorsed one of those candidates, and that was Hoke Smith, who eventually went on to win that election. Clark Howell did not win. But the vitriol and the language, people think that, presidential elections in the 21st century can get bad. These gubernatorial elections in the Deep South at that time were really bad, and very much so in the case of the effect on African Americans and the African American communities. Dan, there were things that were said, demonized black men, made them look to the white community as if they were nothing but predators, that black people could not be trusted, they were thieves and vagabonds, that they were less intelligent than the white community, so therefore they had to be managed and kept in their place, otherwise they would threaten the white community. So that's the backdrop of the race riot. And in September of that year, 1906, the Atlanta newspapers, both that I just mentioned and a few others, actually reported 4 possible assaults. And the bad thing about this is that over time, and even in that time, they could never substantiate that the assaults actually took place. But what they said was that there were 4 black perpetrators who assaulted local white women. And Mayor James G. Woodward was mayor of Atlanta at that time, and he had a mess on his hands because, and these politicians in the middle of this gubernatorial campaign and all of this stuff that was going on in Atlanta whipped the community into a frenzy, and eventually black businesses were burned, white mobs to the streets, black people were trying to defend themselves, and it became basically a free-for-all in Atlanta for that time period. And the black leadership of Atlanta was crying out for help because, number one, no one could ever prove that any of that happened and that any crimes were perpetrated, but there were certainly crimes being perpetrated against the black community as a result of all that hype.
Right. Now, it's fascinating that at that time in 1906, the white community turned this around where whites feared blacks and the threat of blacks in that community. 1909, you talk about starting in April. A woman named Della Reed is found in a trash pile. A black woman, Della Reed.
That's right.
1909. And then March 5th, Estella Baldwin is found with a concussion, struck in the head. 1 month later after that, Georgia Brown, gunshot wound. Next day, a woman named Maddie Smith, gunshot. And the next month, Lavinia Austin. And still in May, another woman named Sarah Dukes, a gunshot as well as Frances Lampkin. And near Labor Day, Eliza Griggs. And then October, Maggie Brooks. Now, tell us about this, what predates this in terms of Jack the Ripper, which was in 1888 in London. What's the effect of Jack the Ripper in the story, 1909, and then eventually the reporting and the term coined for this assailant, the Atlanta Ripper? Tell us a little bit of the background of Jack the Ripper and his story and its effect on the community before 1909.
That's a good question. You hit something very important there, the term Ripper, and they called the press, but that was actually a term that was applied to the murderer behind this, or the murderers. At that time, everybody kind of thought, it's just one murderer. So they called him the Fiend, and then eventually the Ripper, and they began to use terms like Ripper, like murder. The effect that the Jack the Ripper phenomenon had on the publications at the time and the mindset of the community as these stories rolled out of the major newspapers in Atlanta and around the state was it hung like a pall. And it was a dark cloud that hung over all of this, because even though a lot of society at that time, particularly in the Deep South, was illiterate, people knew about Jack the Ripper. That has become a phenomenon, almost a cultural thing. Anytime you mention serial killer today, people will they'll talk about Jack the Ripper, even if they don't study, the history of crime. And that's also the case in that day and age as well. And so the modus operandi of the Jack the Ripper murders was slitting the throats, disemboweling, basically, if you will, mangling the bodies of the women. Certain things were removed from their bodies, body parts. It's almost as if the Ripper himself in the West End, Whitechapel district of London, was taking a prize. And you do see some evidence of that here, too, with the Atlanta Ripper. But that story began to kind of hang over these murders, and so naturally it just makes a lot of common sense to me that eventually journalists would call this Ripper-like murders, and then eventually the name the Atlanta Ripper. And of course, the Atlanta Ripper preyed on young women, young African-American women. They called them mulatto women. And so the Ripper in London preyed on white women. So there are some similarities in the murder, in the murder sprees.
Right. Let's just pause for a moment for these commercials. We talked about Jack the Ripper and its effect, and the women that I had mentioned that were killed by month, and we mentioned that in the Incredible, that were attacked on Saturday and found on Sunday. And this spree begins with this one per month, and then very many similarities to the condition that the women were found and some of the things that were done to these women, which included, and this part of the Ripper description, the slitting of their throats. Mm-hmm. Tell us, as you mentioned, the Constitution and the Journal were separate newspapers. What was the treatment initially from the two different newspapers in terms of what was happening in terms of black women being brutally killed in Atlanta?
Well, as you can imagine, that particular story, or those stories, did not get a lot of press. Today, if that had happened in most any community in Georgia or around the country, especially a murder or a series of murders that gruesome, that would draw a lot of attention. It could also be described as, fodder for sensationalist writing. because it's there. There's such a lot of graphic details, and the murders themselves were quite macabre. But unfortunately, from 1909, the early 20th century in the Deep South, and I would argue the early 20th century in a lot of places in America, what was happening in the black community in the way of crime did not go as highlighted and heavily reported as, say, if this had happened in the white community.
Sure.
The fact that these were also young women, and as I told you earlier, there's tension between the black elites and the black working class, and then there's a lot of tension between the two races, period. The fact that these are these are domestics. For example, a lot of the women who were walking home or walking to their places of employment were walking to homes of white Atlantans where they worked as domestic servants. There was a lot of tension in the black community between the upper class and the working class. So, those race riots also had painted black people as, black men particularly, as predators. This plays into that narrative, if you know what I mean, in the white community, or that had been spun for the white community and spun by the political leadership and even journalists at that time and corporatists at that time about the black community in Atlanta or the black community in general. So when you see the press treat these stories, they treat them very mildly. A lot of times it's just one column. It's not a very large story. Later on, that does change, and that would be insufferable today. We would immediately have a public outcry if something like this happened in the community and it was not highlighted or the media did not focus on it. But they certainly did not do much with it in the early years of this phenomenon.
Now, despite this every month attack and these numerous attacks, you write that 1910 rolled into 1911, things got worse. So 1910 was certainly not as bad as 1909, but certainly 1911, things got worse. And Rosa Trice, the 35-year-old, is found dead 75 yards from her home. And this is a little different descriptions of what happens to these bodies. This body was dragged by the perpetrator after her death. There's no weapon left behind, but the left side of her head is crushed with a blunt instrument, stabbed in the jaw, and again, her throat cut. In this particular case, they do arrest somebody for this murder. Who do they arrest, and what happens as a result?
Well, there were several people over the course of time that ended up being hauled in by the Atlanta Police Department. And the strange thing here, Dan, is it almost seemed like they would have evidence that would point in the direction of these men possibly being the killer. And in some instances, I do believe that the killer, it could have been that individual they hauled in did perpetrate the murder that he was hauled in for. But in many instances, you've got people like Henry Huff, who was, basically 27 years old and did fit the description that some of these women, that two of the women gave, or fit the description that several of the women gave, and fit the description of those who saw a perpetrator running from what would eventually be identified as the scene of a murder. But there was eventually some question about whether or not Henry Huff had committed any murders. Interestingly enough, there was a young woman who was killed, Sadie Holly, and Henry Huff himself was with her the night that she died.
Right.
To be honest with you, it would really be so difficult to try to pinpoint any one person or any of the people. They hauled in people that we just now found out about. In some research that was conducted after my book was published recently, a journalist has uncovered where another individual was arrested. He went almost unnoticed by me and other researchers until recently. Honestly, that's the hardest part of this whole story, man. It really is. I can tell you a lot about the murder victims themselves, but inside the story of the Atlanta Ripper, the men who are accused and eventually who are put on trial, there's almost nothing about them. Almost nothing.
You write about the people that are accused, Todd Henderson, Henry Huff, and then later Leo Frank are accused, and various other people. But this is based on victims surviving, getting away, and offering a description. And then we haven't talked about the point where even the Constitution, the newspaper, agrees and gets on board that the term the Atlanta Ripper should be used, and the murders previous from 1909 can be considered the work of the Ripper. And they operate accordingly in the media in that way. So let's go to that and discuss that.
Sure. Well, one of the things, for example, going back to like Todd Henderson, one of the things that's unique, or not unique, but one of the things that's very telling about these murders is that a lot of these women, of course, their throats were cut with a very sharp object, or they were bashed in the head with a very blunt object. Now, going back to someone like Todd Henderson was married, and one of the things that really was like a missile right at his chest was when his wife basically testified and told police that he was lying because Todd Henderson said, "I don't even own a razor or a pocket knife. I've never even had one in the last few years," I believe he said. Well, his wife said, "Well, no, actually that's not true. He had a pocket knife. I just borrowed it. And he did own a razor." Well, that goes back to the idea these women, a lot of them were cut, their throats were cut with a razor or knife, very sharp knife object. And you're going to see that also very similar to what you saw in London with the Jack the Ripper murders. Now, some of the murders that were earlier than this, before Henderson, Todd Henderson, and Henry Huff, and even when Jim Conley becomes somewhat of a suspect because of the Mary Fagan and the Leo Frank episode, some of those women before and after that particular time frame were shot. So you do have some women, I believe one of the early, and you have to remember there's so many of these victims, it sometimes is very, very hard to keep up with them, but I believe one of your earliest victims was shot. And there was also some investigation that was done that kind of pointed fingers at the husband. But the basic gist here is that the brunt of these murders did not take place, or they were not perpetrated with a shotgun or a pistol. They were perpetrated with a very sharp, blunt object. And so you've got guys like Todd Henderson, Henry Huff, and then later Jim Conley accused, and they would say things, and then someone else would come in and say, "No, he did own this. No, we have seen him with this." So that is what makes it difficult to assign or to complete a list of murder victims and attribute them to the Ripper phenomenon, much less an actual perpetrator himself, if that makes sense.
Let's explain, I'll let you explain how it works that the police claim that this is the work of the Atlanta Ripper, and the papers declare further murders as not attributed to Huff or Henderson. Both of these people are in jail, and yet murders are still being attributed to the Atlanta Ripper. How do they reconcile that being these people investigated being such great suspects, yet what they reported was different?
Yeah, it's interesting because I don't know in the annals of criminal history, especially in criminology, if the term copycat killer had been used yet. And so, but this is possibly what we have here. I think it is absolutely 100% provable that Henry Huff and Todd Henderson did not commit all of these murders if they committed any of them. And there's viable proof that at least, Todd Henderson was involved. I think Sadie Holly might definitely have been killed by Todd Henderson. But I don't think either one of these gentlemen killed all of these women. So it brings up the question of what was the Atlanta Ripper. Do we have something here in the way of a copycat killing or copycat killing? Now, as I mentioned before, some of those early murders we think were committed by angry husbands. But you also have this going on in the press. People are talking about it on the streets. And in the black community, the ministers, the leadership in the black community, Henry Hugh Proctor, Alonzo Herndon, who was a black businessman and one of the members of the black elite in Atlanta, they were talking about it. And so your average African-American denizen of the city of Atlanta knew what was going on. It was being talked about, and it greatly impacted their community. So with that being said, you could certainly have the potential for an angry husband or someone who had a vendetta against a young African-American female to have committed a murder and then it be blamed on the Atlanta Ripper, it would be a great place to hide, if that makes sense. Because the talk on the street was not just about the murders, but the talk on the street was also how they were committed. And don't forget that the white leadership of Atlanta was also talking about this and pointing the fingers at the black community, saying, see, if we were right in the 1906 race riots. They weren't, but they claimed they were. If they're willing to do, if you've got men who are going to do this to their own women on the street, they'll do this to white women on the street. So you could possibly have an angry husband who hid under that cover, and this wasn't a Ripper murder. This was just a copycat.
Now, how did the media reconcile this? And when you talked about people discussed the details, other than the throat slit, and then later we'll talk about some other unusual similarities with some of the other murders with the missing shoes. But officially, how many of these women really were connected with the similar traits in the way they were actually murdered?
There were more than a few. And the way the press tended to handle that is they continued to use terminology like Ripper-like murder, or the Atlanta Ripper, or the Atlanta Fiend. So they were continuing to feed the narrative. And if you read the material, it does lead you to believe they kind of thought there might have been one guy behind this earlier on. But then there's some press that emerges, some articles that emerge, especially after the capture and arrest and incarceration of people like Henry Huff and Todd Henderson, that it was very possible. It looked like the press kind of was open to the possibility that there may be more than one. Now, what happens in Atlanta at that time is you also have some people, some political leaders and some business leaders in the white community who take that and kind of push that forward and say, well, it may not be one. They're all susceptible to doing this. So what would make you think this would just be one person? What I didn't get the impression of, Dan, when I read a lot of these articles, was that there was some strange phenomenon at work, or there was this mysterious serial killer who was, in a black hat and a black cape and all black, and, had a bandit's mask on his face and was lurking around black neighborhoods just ready to stab any young, nice-looking, attractive black woman who passed by in the back, or, rip her throat open. That impression from the press. They were, if you read it carefully, they were a bit mystified by this too, particularly after Huff and Henderson were arrested. And then after Mary Fagan's episode, after the Leo Frank Mary Fagan ordeal, that begins to fade a good bit from public view. Right.
Let's use this as an opportunity to stop for a second, hear from our sponsor, which is FabFitFun. In my wife Lisa's fall FabFitFun box, Lisa was especially excited to try So Rich, vitamin E infused cuticle oil by NCLA. In the fall and the winter, Lisa says, her cuticles split, and so another fantastic product, discovery from FabFitFun, for her daily routine. Lisa loves having FabFitFun boxes delivered, so there's no need to leave home to shop. The fall box can be customized in 180,000 different ways. Lisa has received FabFitFun boxes for almost 3 years now, and is always very excited to get each new box. The fall box, 8 to 10 full-size products, and customizable. Individually, the products would retail for over $500, but with coupon code MURDER, $39. Lisa recommends FabFitFun to everyone she encounters at work or out socially because of the incredible value of these unique, amazing items. It's time to customize your box for the full fall season. Sign up today to receive your first box and join a community of over 1 million women who are already obsessed. Use coupon code MURDER for $10 off your first box at fabfitfun.com. Use coupon code MURDER for $10 off your first box at fabfitfun.com. Now, we talked about the incredible situation and quandary that the media is in, essentially, and the police are in, essentially, and the black community is organized to be able to pressure the white community to be able to maybe hire black detectives, as you write, to do something, to offer a reward, offer a more significant reward to try to stem this panic and this this horror in the black community, especially, and in the community of Atlanta itself. So what happens next in terms of this fight to be able to try to find the Atlanta Ripper?
Well, it did take a turn in the sense that the black community at first was a little alarmed at the crime on the streets in Atlanta. And of course, you can't have mention in the newspapers of a young black woman being murdered, under the cover of darkness on the streets of Atlanta trying to walk to or back home from work. And so that, of course, does capture the attention of the black community. But as these murders began to, as I said before, turn up almost weekly, and, the bloodbath you see in 1911, it's very difficult for the black community to ignore this. Now, where the outcry came from was tradition, and this has been very traditional in the black community, and you see it even today, was from the black pulpit. Eventually you see things like mass meetings at churches. You see business leaders begin to unite with spiritual and religious leaders in the black community. As a matter of fact, there was one really big meeting that was advertised in the local papers that took place at Wheat Street Baptist Church, and it took place in the afternoon. It wasn't even a traditional Sunday morning service. It wasn't a nightly speech. They were very serious. They were out broadcasting and making a public statement in the middle of the day. And what they were doing was they were trying to bring attention not only to the problem. You have, Reverend Bryant, you have Dr. P.C. Parks, Reverend Stinson, Henry Rucker, who was a very prominent Republican and appointed to a high government position I believe it was by President McKinley in Atlanta, were all there. And they were crying out for the Atlanta Police Department to take this seriously, and they were basically asking not only the mayor of Atlanta, but also the governor of Georgia at the time to further these investigations, and they were asking for resources, to at least begin to stop the murders on the streets. At first the temperament was not necessarily just to find out who was doing it, but it was, let's do something to stop this. And as you mentioned earlier, yes, I did write about the plea from these black community leaders to hire a black detective on the Atlanta and black police officers in the Atlanta Police Department. That's not something that would happen for a while, a couple of more decades.
What happens in terms of the trials for Huff and Henderson? And for the listener, did murders attributable to the Atlanta Ripper stop, cease, or completely disappear while these two were in custody?
They didn't. There were more murders after Henderson and Huff were both in police custody. During all of that time, you do have splotches of clusters, if you will, around the city where crime was happening, and every once in a while, these type of murders would pop up. As a matter of fact, one of the points I made in the book was that we go all the way into 1913, 1914, all the way into 1915, and you have the newspapers in Atlanta who are reporting on Ripper-like murders and still using the term the Atlanta Ripper, even in those years. Then eventually you see newspapers in the metro Atlanta, what today would be considered the metro Atlanta area, up in Gainesville, Georgia, Hall County, which is today a good 40 or 50 miles from the center of downtown or the city center. There are murders that crop up there. There are murders in 1912. So the Atlanta papers actually still continue to report on Ripper-like murders even after those men have been apprehended, which of course brings on its own discussion and its own talk. There could definitely be more than, or assumptions that there could have been more than one murder. There could have been more than one killer, and that these murders were not all accomplished by one individual. That's why I use the term potential copycat killers.
At some point, very much like the Jack the Ripper murders and their escalation, these murders attributable to the Atlanta Ripper, there are cases and instances where mutilation is one-upped from before, and you write that the corpse was found beyond in a gruesome state. So there is some development in terms of disembowelment and things comparable to Jack the Ripper in the Atlanta Ripper murders, isn't there?
There are some instances of these attacks that resulted in body parts being moved. I believe I'd have to go back specifically to the book, but based just on my memory and notes, there was actually one of the young women who had a breast removed. And then you also mentioned a little earlier about shoes being removed. And you talk to criminologists, and they will tell you that that is commensurate with, and it jives a good bit with some of the theories about serial killers and these kinds of crimes, that they do, they always like, or a lot of them like to take prizes. And we know that Jack the Ripper did that. We know that serial killers in the modern era have done that. And it looks like, I would argue that maybe some of these murders were done, there may have been copycats, but some of them were actually committed by the same guy. And it's very possible that when those kinds of things happen and you have, a prize, if you will, taken, or a memento, as sick as that sounds, taken from the scene and from the body of the victim, that maybe that is probably the work, or at least that individual had committed one of the murders previous. And then some of them were just bad to begin with. They didn't go as far as removal of a breast or something like that. But for example, there was about 6 miles from the city of Atlanta, right, not far, well, a couple of miles from the Chattahoochee River, a young woman had been murdered. And the thing that happened was he did this with 2 attacks. Her throat was slashed, and also there was slashes and gash marks all over her body. And she had also been knocked in the head with some big blunt object, and her head had been bashed in. Well, what you got to understand there is think about that. Any one of those things probably would have caused death. Slashing the throat, hitting someone, picking up something large and heavy and bashing someone in the head with it. Those are 2 things that are going to bring death. But not only was one of those done, 2 were done. And on top of that, this young woman, who only was like, I think, less than 120 pounds, was around 20, 25 years old. There were gashes and slash marks all over her body. That is sort of macabre and sick in and of itself. And again, that takes us back to, like, Jack the Ripper, who would not only remove body parts, but the manner of death was from gashing, bashing, and then later on the bodies would be mutilated because, we do have disemboweled bodies. We have the removal of body parts, very similar to what you see here.
Right. Now, you write about August 7th, 1912, and there's lots of talk of copycats, or at least there's suspicion of that. And a person named Lawton Brown is arrested, and he confesses to the murder of Eva Florence from November 1911 murder. What is he being held on suspicion, though, of at that same time, despite just confessing to the murder of Eva Florence?
Well, it's kind of interesting when you look at, how they hauled him in, and, they called him a modern Bluebeard. And they claimed that he had 12 wives, and they were all his victims. And so one of the things I think that went against Lawton Brown, and that he might have been guilty of, was he looked a lot like what people described the Atlanta Ripper to look like. First of all, he was an African-American man, okay? He was also described in the press as having eyes that dart about nervously as though he were in, perpetual fear. Now, interesting thing is when they bring him in, and you got to understand here, Dan, what that tells us is that police brought him in partially because he looked guilty. Okay.
Yeah.
Looked suspicious, and also it's interesting because they described him as being well dressed. Now, there was some turmoil and tension between the wealthier black community and the white community. At that time, it was considered, out of character and somewhat of a disgrace for a black man to be wealthy and well dressed and on the same level as a white man. That was absolutely, something that you couldn't get out. You just couldn't wrap your mind around if you were a white man in that frame of mind in the early 1900s. And you're right. He did make a full confession. He claimed that he had killed a woman by the name of Eva Florence. There's so many things that were also brought up about that confession, I believe. And Lawton Brown is one of the potential murderers that I didn't focus on as much, and he's not one that just jumps right out at me, not like Henry Huff and Todd Henderson. But they went so far as to actually hire a medical professional. I think his name was Dr. Martin in the book, who evaluated his mental acuity, because Lawton Brown began to make, first of all, he was brought in because he looked suspicious, but then they tried to pin 12 of the murders on him. Mm-hmm. And he was making a lot of weird statements. He was very erratic. The confession, I think later on, I'll have to go back and check my notes, but I believe the confession was even thrown out or was even challenged because it was so strange. Now, when Dr. Martin, I believe that was his name, when he came in and evaluated Lawton Brown, one of the things in his report was that Lawton Brown was a maniac and that he suffered, and I don't mean that to be funny, but he suffered from mania.
Right.
And also was kind of funny because they began to really, really, as police would call it, stick it to him and really press down on him and bear down on him. And they noticed that he had a better idea, and he knew almost as much about all of the murders in the Atlanta area than some of them did. Now that renewed suspicion. Okay.
Yeah.
As a matter of fact, it got to a point where he could tell them where these murders happened. He could tell them their names. He could tell them, how the women were killed. And strangely enough, if I'm not mistaken, he said something like he had been there and seen a couple of the murders happen. And then at that point, he began to describe what was going on and how the murderer attacked and killed the victims. Now, you and I you're sitting there thinking the same thing I did when I first read that. Well, if he was there and saw all these things, number one, why didn't he try to stop it? Number two, why didn't he ever report it? Those are strange things. The other thing is remember now, this is, from what I can understand, I can't prove this, but what I can understand is, Lawton Brown was not a man who could read and write very well. I can't remember where I heard that, but I believe one of the articles mentions that he doesn't read and write very well. But he had an incredible memory, and it sounded like if he weren't the murderer, he had an insatiable appetite for knowledge and details about the crime spree, about the killing. He was probably the strangest. Now, when you go back to Todd Henderson, who lied about not having I don't have a pocket knife and I don't own a razor, that's logical. I would do that if I were accused, and if I did have one, I would probably lie and say I didn't. Unfortunately, his wife contradicted him. But this is beyond strange. So there's some evidence there that he knew more than he knew more than the average bear, and then there's some evidence there that he could have suffered, as Dr. Martin said, from intense mania. That he had some mental issues, and that's what that spawned from.
Now let's get to a case that basically pivots this investigation and distracts it somewhat. When you talk about the Mary Fagan, the murder of Mary Fagan, and then her boss is looked at the factory where she works, Leo Frank, and then somebody named Jim Conley. So tell us what happens in this particular case here.
Well, in 1913, and I believe it was Confederate Memorial Day when it happened, young Mary Fagan, who was somewhere around 13 or 14 years old, she had worked for the National Pencil factory in Atlanta, and I believe that was on Marietta Street. And she traveled on this particular day to go pick up her money, and she never made it out of the factory. And eventually her boss, Leo Frank, who was a Jewish man who came from New York, and you do have a lot of Jewish people that do come south at the turn of the century during the industrial age to capitalize on the opportunity of diversification of industry and the attempt to diversify the economy in the South, and he was one of them. And on April 26th, someone inside that factory raped and murdered Mary Fagan. There was another man who was in the factory and was also accused of being an accomplice, and his name was Jim Conley. He worked there. And one person actually, or several people, said he may have definitely been involved with it or could have been the murderer himself because he had blood stains on his shirt and was seen washing them out. Strangely enough, Jim Conley, who was, by the way, a tall, slender African-American man, he was questioned by police and actually confessed that he helped Leo Frank dispose of the body after Leo Frank murdered Mary Fagan. Now, where all this goes is, naturally, you can put two and two together. Many people began to think Jim Conley, tall, slender, African-American man, was, if he helped Leo Frank dispose of the body, then that meant that, he had an inclination for violence and murder in him, and he could easily have been either the Atlanta Ripper or one of the murderers behind these episodes. And so that's bantered around and thrown around a good bit. However, he's more associated with the Mary Fagan murder than Atlanta Ripper murderers, and pretty much even the Pinkerton agents who were there and were helping to investigate the Mary Fagan murder, even said, they didn't put any credence in that. They said there's nothing there to prove that, and it's highly unlikely. But he was fingered for that too. Now you got to understand something, Dan. That also builds into the narrative that's being spun about black men. If he was there, according to some white people at the time, he probably was involved. And if he's confessed that he helped Leo Frank, who was a New York Jew in their words, who was just a shade short, if you will, of a black man. I mean, that's their language, not mine. They can't be trusted any more than, the black guy can be trusted. If he helped him dispose of a body, then that just proves that these black men are predators and they're prone to violence, and they have some sort of gene inside of them that, pretty much pushes them to this. So it feeds into that narrative. But I think we can pretty much say Jim Conley was just very much a lack of evidence that he was involved in any of these murders.
Right. Now, you write that 1914, while the city and the nation focused on Leo Frank, looks like the Ripper struck again, but this time he contacted police through writing.
Yeah.
Now, you write, it appears the killer or someone pretending to be attracted the police by way of firefighters. He left it at one of these pulled fire alarms at fireboxes.
Right.
Now, what is the gist of the note that he sends, and how does he sign it? But what's the gist of it before we talk about how he signs it?
Well, yeah. Before I go into that, does that not sound familiar? Leaving a note.
Sure.
If you're tying these in, and it gives the press, when they see this, I mean, it just substantiates the use of the term, the Atlanta Jack the Ripper or the Atlanta Ripper,
right.
Because as we know, the Ripper, used the From Hell monikers, and eventually that spawned a movie with a couple of well-known actors. But these, it was interesting because it was Fire Station House number 2, and there were these false alarms that went off. And what they eventually figured out, more than likely, was going on was someone was pulling these fire alarms at fire alarm boxes that were placed around the city. Now, all of them in that particular time frame came from alarms were alarms on the south side of town, and they figured out that all 3 of the boxes were very close to one another. I have in my notes Washington Street, Jefferson Street, Whitehall Terrace, Richardson Street, Love Street. These are all areas where they found where these alarms were going off, and then they find a card, and it is signed very interestingly.
There's one more suspect. Well, there's a couple more suspects, but one more interesting suspect is Louis Drake, and there's a murder of Anna Drake. Why was he considered a possible Atlanta Ripper suspect?
I believe, if I'm not mistaken, I believe this was Anna Drake was the woman who was rushed over to Grady Hospital. That's right? And she had been attacked. Yeah, she had been attacked from the back, or at least had been cut up from the back. And there were some injuries to her appendages, her arms and fingers. The thing that got Louis Drake in trouble was he said something to her, and I want to tie this in with the card and with the press. Mm-hmm. He told her that he was going to pretend to be or act like Jack the Ripper. Well, that's how this guy signed the card, and of course that's also what the press was using. then, of course, he began to assault his wife, Anna Drake. And I also want to go back to where I said that some of these men or some of these murders were committed, they did find out, by men who were the husbands of the victims. And that's why it kind of feeds into the possibility that some of these murders were committed by angry husbands who were using this cloak, this covering of the Atlanta Jack the Ripper. And to be honest with you, kind of looks like Louis Drake was doing that too. Now, one thing to point out that's very important for your listeners is the Atlanta police might have used that terminology to describe what happened, but they did not consider Anna Drake's assault, her attack, and Louis Drake, the attack on her by Louis Drake, to be a Ripper murder.
Right. Now, you say that despite hauling in some more people as well, Henry Harper and other people, but you say many of these are simply linked to their own murders themselves of either their wives or somebody they were associated with. The murders that are linked to the Atlanta Ripper go from 1909, and you say, to 1915, but in terms of the press, there's still some attribution to the Atlanta Ripper up to 1920, isn't there?
That's right. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, the murder that I mentioned in Gainesville, Georgia, that happened, and I'm pretty sure that every listener won't understand the geography of Georgia, but Gainesville is north of the city. It's northeast of the city a good ways. That one was as well, I won't even say that one was as far away as you could get as far as the press pinning the murder or making it a Ripper-like murder, because in 1911 there was a murder in Waycross, Georgia, which is down on the Florida line near the Okefenokee Swamp, that was Ripper-like. And the press said while it was kind of unlikely that this was the same guy, that they still left the door open because they described the murder and it sounded a lot like what had been happening in Atlanta. But going on into the early 1920s, I believe there was even an episode, maybe even as far away as 1922, where the press reports on details of a murder that they then say, could easily have been a Ripper-like murder. So, yeah, absolutely. The press doesn't give up on that. And it doesn't always, it's not always Metro Atlanta where they pinpoint that these murders could have, or that these Ripper-like murders took place.
You talk about, in the end of the book, about the theories, the prevalent theories, as time has gone on and historians have re-examined, like yourself, examined these crimes to make sense of who might have possibly been the Atlanta Ripper, or other possibilities as well, including that there was no such thing as the Atlanta Ripper whatsoever. Tell us about the various theories briefly and what you thought of them.
Well, let me first of all say, before I do get to that, there was talking about theories abound, and one of the theories that abounds was that there were multiple killers. And I'm just going to go ahead and tell you, and I think you probably assumed this, interpreted this from the book and that chapter, that I believe there were multiple killers. I don't believe there was just one Atlanta Ripper. There's too many guys that were hauled in. Lawton Brown, Henry Huff, Todd Henderson. I don't believe that Louis Drake was part of the phenomenon. I just think he was somebody who spouted off at the mouth and used this that was going on at the time as cover, or was possibly just kind of a mean guy who was trying to scare his wife at the same time he was doing harm to her. But even as far away as, 1924, they're claiming that there was a Ripper-like murder in the city. There was also another guy by the name of Claude Alexander who killed a woman, or was accused of killing a couple of women. And the strange thing about Claude Alexander, is he lived on Garibaldi Street. Now, I went to Garibaldi Street and took some pictures for the book, but the interesting thing here is that that's where one of the one of the earliest victims in 1911 happened to live or happened to be killed. So there you have someone else that kind of emerges out of the shadows. That leads me to believe that there were multiple murders. I believe that a lot of this comes out of all of this hysteria. It comes out of the chaos that's going on in Atlanta at this time. I believe that Black Atlanta is whipped into a frenzy out of fear because they don't know if they're being protected by the Atlanta Police Department and if any serious attention is being given to bring this murderer in and to stop these murders. And apparently there wasn't, and in their mind there wasn't, because they continued, to happen. There were men who were brought in that looked guilty that weren't convicted. There were people who popped up who were suspects, but yet when you looked at it, they were only being accused of killing one or two of the victims. There are husbands who killed wives, Charles McNeil and Lucinda McNeil, Charlie Owens and Alice Owens, Louis Drake and Anna Drake. I mean, but you have a victim, Emma Lou Sharp, whose mother, Lena Sharp, was killed by the Atlanta Ripper, and then Emma Lou Sharp is actually able to, she's attacked by the Atlanta Ripper and lives to tell about it. So, and she actually, she identified him. She managed to get away from him, but he spoke to her, and she was able to identify him, and later on, I believe, eventually pinpoints or fingers one of the suspects and eventually says, I think that's the one, So the description that's on the street is tied back to what happened to Lena and Emma Lou Sharp. By the way, that's a mother and daughter there. Can you imagine the horror of being by your mother's killer? Yeah. She went out on the streets to try to find her mother because she was basically, she'd been missing. And they find out she's attacked and she's killed. Then later on, Emma Lou Sharp herself is killed. So we do know something was at work here. We do know that there was a tall African-American man who did attack young African-American women on the streets of Atlanta. Now, Lena Sharp was a little older. Emma Lou was younger. So then there's also other theories that this was not even a black man. There are those who believe that this was possibly concocted by the white community in Atlanta to stir up the black community, to also continue to whip the white community into a frenzy, to continue to spin the narrative that black men were predators and that the only way to keep white women on the street was to keep black men or to keep the black community in its place and continue to push to continue segregation and the basic idea of the Jim Crow South. Then, of course, you have the theory that Jim Conley was the Atlanta Ripper. Again, there's very little in the way of proof. There was a detective by the name of W.J. Burns. It just fell apart very quickly because another thing too is Jim Conley was accused of participating in the murder of Mary Fagan, who was a 13-year-old white girl. The Atlanta Ripper killed young women in their 20s for the most part, but they were black and they were domestic servants. They were part of the black working class. Now, some of them, and I didn't even get into this, but some of them were actually accused, the women, and this is kind of the blame the victim mentality that happens in a lot of instances. Some of them were accused of being ladies of the evening and what you would call girls, or today we would call them sex workers. That wasn't true in every instance, and some of the people who made those accusations really had no right to make those accusations, and it even got all the way up to Reverend Henry Hugh Proctor, who made some of those accusations, and some of the black ministers began to preach sermons and make public statements that chided young black women for even being on the streets, and they began to attack the black community for being in the dives and the saloons, which there were a lot of in Atlanta along Peter Street and some of the places in the old Fourth Ward where these murders happened. So it got to be kind of a let's look inward and blame ourselves and what did we do wrong that contributed to this. But I just absolutely do not believe Jim Conley had anything to do with it. I don't know whether he had anything to do with Mary Fagan's murder or not. There's evidence to point that he did. There's evidence that points that Leo Frank was involved in some way, and then there's some credible evidence that he wasn't the murderer. It's a mess. It really is. And these historical cases are so confounding. I don't believe truly that there was just one murderer. To me, it's almost impossible because Henry Huff, Todd Henderson, these guys were, and others that had been apprehended were locked up, but the murders went on. I believe there were some initial murders that were attributed to one person, and I believe there were a series of copycat killings, and I believe there was also a lot of domestic abuse and violence that went all the way to the extreme under the cloak of the Atlanta Ripper phenomenon.
Yes. You's right, too, that soon after, in a few years, the U.S. would be in the throes of depression, and this crime spree in Atlanta, a distant memory. I want to thank you very much, Jeffery Wells, for coming on and talking about the Atlanta Ripper, the unsolved case of the Gate City's most infamous murders. For those that might want to find out more about this book, is there a website, Facebook page? How might they do that?
Well, you can actually go to the History Press website. It's not featured because it's about 10 years old, but you can search that out on their website and read more about it. You can also check out my Blogspot page, which is georgiamysteries.blogspot.com, and you can put in the search bar the Atlanta Ripper, and there's a few articles about the Atlanta Ripper that are there. And of course, if anybody out there wants to, communicate with me, I get emails all the time about this and several other books I've written. Please feel free.
Thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure. The Atlanta Ripper, the unsolved case of the Gate City's most infamous murders with Jeffery Wells. Thank you very much, Jeffery. You have a great evening. Good night.
Thank you.